Great.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another very exciting seminar in our online evolution and ecology series. My name is Drought, and I'm a postdoc at the University of British Columbia. Myself and the other organizers, Elizabeth, Andreas, and Wouter, are honored to have with us today Dr. Craig Packer, Distinguished McKnight Professor in the College of Biological Sciences and founder and director of the Lion Research Center at the University of Minnesota. Professor Packer is a leading expert on African lions and the head of the Serengeti Lion Project, which has been monitoring and studying lion populations in Africa for decades. He has made invaluable contributions to the understanding of lion behavior, the lion's role in savanna ecosystems, and their interaction with humans. He has also guided policy change and identified strategies for the species conservation. In recognition of his work, Professor Packer has received numerous honors and awards, among which a Guggenheim Fellowship for Natural Sciences. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has received the John Burroughs Medal for his book Into Africa. Before I give the word to our speaker, I just want to remind everyone watching that, as always, there will be a Q&A session after the talk. If you would like to post questions for the speaker, you can do so in our designated Slack channel, where you can also upvote the questions that you would like to see answered. So with that, thank you very much, Professor Packer, for accepting our invitation, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak in your series. It's nice to have an opportunity to continue to discuss science with people, despite all the travel bans and social gathering restrictions. So one of the problems with Zoom, of course, is that I can't quite tell when people are getting restless because I'm not keeping the level of excitement sufficiently high. So let's see if we can find some interest in all the stuff that I'm about to tell you. The topic I want to talk about today is ultimately on the assumption that I'm going to test thoroughly that the lion is obviously the top predator, but that it is ultimately food limited. So in a natural population where there are not massive amounts of anthropogenic disturbance, lions are feeding without serious competition from other predators, and that what limits their ability to produce more lions is the amount of food they can take in a period of time. And this ultimately can help us ask some questions when we're thinking about the conservation status of a species like lions and saying, well, how many lions should there be? And then we can use that to say how well that population is being managed or conserved. So I'm going to focus first on food, and then, as I said, this is based on the assertion that lions really are food limited. And then I'm going to go and show you briefly, if I have time, how they really are not bothered by other species, other predators in particular. So, okay. So the important thing about any study like this is you need to be tracking individuals through time. And so in the Serengeti National Park and in Ngorongoro Crater in Tanzania, lions have been individually recognized, and the system that has been used has traditionally focused on these little markings here. So if you look at your own cat at home, you'll find they have these rows of whiskers, and they often have a few extra whisker spots. They have a few extra whisker spots above that I put in these white boxes. This is the same individual at 8 months of age, and then at 6 years of age. You can see that little triangle of spots is not changed. Likewise, this one from 2 years to 8 years. So these are very stable. And so in northern Tanzania, there are these two areas where lions have been studied for a very long period of time, beginning in the 1960s, when George Schaller came out and then ultimately wrote an account of that called The Serengeti Lion for the University of Chicago Press in 1972. And so Schaller's original study area was approximately in this area, and this is an area where we were able to monitor the lions for almost 50 years. Adjacent to this is another smaller area, a pretty much enclosed ecosystem, the Ngorongoro Crater. And so there are going to be times I'm going to be talking about the Ngorongoro Crater population. And there's times I'm going to be talking about the lions in the Serengeti. And in the Serengeti, you imagine these wide open spaces of short grass plains and everything. And that's the southern part of this. But there's also a lot of the area in the northern half of the region, or the northern proportion, that we call the woodlands. And as I'll show you, there's differences between the woodlands, the plains, and the crater. And if I could, okay. Okay. So just some basic background about this system. There is a striking seasonality in rainfall, and the rainfall is strongest in certain areas and lowest. So this down here is the Serengeti Plains, where typically has less rainfall through the year, but it's the same seasonal pattern. The woodlands, which I said was the northern part of the Serengeti system, as you go further north, you get more and more rain. And in the crater, you have very intensive rain during the rainy season. Now, in the Serengeti, we're looking at a migratory ecosystem. And so this is something that's been really well described with recent work by Grant Hopcraft, who actually is a graduate of UBC, did his master's degree with Tony Sinclair there. And these are Grant's data from GPS-collared wildebeest, which is shown on this bottom down here, and zebra. What we see is that during the wet season, when there is enough rainfall that ordinarily doesn't reach the plains, then the wildebeest and the zebra both down on the short grass plains. And the reason those plains are short, the grasses are short, is because of the intensive grazing by these two species. Further north is where the animals go during the dry season. And so you have this annual migration between wet season, dry season, and the lions that live down here then have to live with a period of not much food and then abundant food from these two species. In contrast, in the Ngorongoro crater, this is an area that the herbivores rely on largely through flooding. And there's a lot of swamps on the floor of the crater. There's all that intensive rain during the rainy season. And then as the swamps recede, there is green grass on the edges. And so the prey abundance in the crater is relatively stable. Serengeti, you've got this vast migration, feast and famine. The crater's a pretty solidly stable food supply. And these are pretty high densities. The crater is only about 250 square kilometers, and yet it's generally home to about 10,000 wildebeest, 4,000 zebra, etc. So this is a very rich place to live. So if we look at the diets of the lions in these three areas, in the crater, where there's year-round access to zebra and wildebeest, there's year-round zebra and wildebeest in the diet. And the third species of great importance is the buffalo, the Cape buffalo. And so really their diet's restricted to those three species. In the Serengeti Plains, during the wet season, so this is December, May is the wet season, the migrants are there, they feast. During the dry season, they're absent, and then they have to rely on a lot of other species, including some of the smaller prey, a lot of them like gazelle, warthog, etc. So this is pretty harsh times for the lions on the plains. The woodlands are somewhere in the middle. They have seasonal access to the migratory species, and then during the dry season, they rely on a bit more of a diverse diet. Now, if you do this in terms of biomass, I mean, this is what the lions are eating almost exclusively in the crater, those three species, buffalo, zebra, and wildebeest. When I get to the details of how many wildebeest does it take to feed a lion, we're really going to be able to look at this in detail in the Ngorongoro crater. But first, we're going to be looking more at what's been going on in the Serengeti. And we have this, again, the availability of a lot of the migratory species during the wet season, absent during the dry season. Okay. Now, we can measure how well the lions are feeding whenever we're fortunate enough to see a lion actually stand up or go for a walk. Because if they've had a huge meal, they have distended their digestive tract, so you can see this pronounced sagging profile of a full belly. And then as they may not eat for a few days, and that shrinks, and then this is 3, is fairly slender lion, but not starving, and now you can see their ribs. And so the larger the number, the thinner the lion. The smaller the number, this is like ranking number 1. We're number 1 in terms of the feeding contest. This is as fat as we can get. And so we know that this recent food intake has a big impact on their short-term behavior. And so if we measure them and they're fairly fat on a particular day, then they tend not to eat. So their belly size is going to shrink in the next few days. So the next day it shrinks by a bit. By the fourth day, you'll still see that they're thinner than they were on that day that you first saw them. If they're very thin, then they compensate, they're going to hunt. So people in like filmmakers are always trying to, shoot pictures of hunting lions. What they want to find are these skinny lions that haven't eaten in a while because they're very likely to hunt. And so the lions, if they haven't fed much, they also tend to move further. They've got to find food. And this is particularly important on the plains where the conditions are more harsh. The lions typically move further regardless of how fat they were, but it's most striking if they're really skinny in one day. Then they're really going to be going out looking for food that day, and they may travel some distance, like 4 or 5 kilometers overnight to find food. So what we see in these 3 habitats is we have in Ngorongoro Crater where the lions are able to maintain a very even keel. And so they're neither too fat nor too thin. On average, they like to stay in this range between 2.5 and 2.75. The plains has a seasonal variation where they're feasting during the wet season and they're starving during the dry season. I've got that mislabeled, sorry about that. And in the woodlands, they're reasonably okay, because in the woodlands of the Serengeti, they have a more diverse diet. They have access to buffalo, which are not present on the plains. Ugh. So I just quickly want to say that these plains lions, we see that food is so important that during the months when the migration is out there, which is December through May, that's also when they have their birth peak. So this blue is the number of cubs per female per month. And so there's a birth peak during the period of time when they're also fatter. And what we see is if you do a regression on how many births you find in the population at different lag times after after they've had a certain amount of food intake, the gestation length is about 3 months. And so as soon as they have an increase in their food supply, about 3 months later, that's when they start having their babies. And then they go into kind of a quiescence and they don't breed during the dry season. They're the really harsh time. Okay, so all of this is just a way of saying, look, food is really important for reproduction. And it doesn't matter whether we're in the crater, whether we're in the woodlands or in the plains, if a female has had a period of time where she hasn't been able to get much to eat, it's going to affect her reproduction. And so these are fatter lions out here. And if they have, when we manage to dart them and to get we can measure how much milk they were producing. The fatter they were, the more milk they were producing. And this is particularly true if we look at their average food intake over the past week prior to the time that we actually got the sample. If the lions are fatter, then their cub survival is much better. So they have about 80% cub survival in years when the mothers are able to maintain at least a belly size of 2.5, but if they're down closer to 3 and they're skinnier, then their cub mortality can be only about 30%. And this also influences how rapidly they can reproduce. So if they're fatter, then they produce cubs about once every 650 days. But if they're thin and they've managed somehow to raise those cubs, nevertheless, it takes them almost 200 days longer to be able to have the next set of offspring. So reproduction obviously depends very strongly on their recent food intake rate. Okay, so that's all background. Now I'm going to get into the populations of the different species in the Serengeti in this migratory ecosystem that present the lions with this wonderful opportunity to feed great during the wet season and be very starving during the dry season. And so this is data that this was all collected by Tony Sinclair, who founded your center at UBC. He's the most important ecologist in the history of the Serengeti. And he was instrumental in maintaining records that counted how many wildebeest were in this vast ecosystem every couple of years, getting historic data from the 1950s and the early 60s, and then being in charge of the monitoring thereafter. And we can see that there was this period of time where the wildebeest population grew exponentially. And this is this is the paradigmatic example of how infectious disease can control animal populations. The wildebeest were affected by a disease called rinderpest, which is closely related to measles, also canine distemper. It got into the Serengeti in the 1890s. It was a viral infection that actually invaded Africa, originating from Asia, but brought there by European settlers to Eastern Africa. This led to a vast die-off. The disease was not controlled. There was no way to eliminate the disease from the population until the early 1960s. Then there was a vaccine. And with the onset of vaccination program around the Serengeti that control the disease in the wildlife, the vaccination was actually only applied to livestock, but by controlling the disease in the livestock, this eliminated the disease from the wildlife, and the wildebeest population grew exponentially. Gazelle were affected to a much less degree than the wildebeest. Buffalo were also affected by rinderpest. So both the buffalo and the wildebeest, which are two of the most important prey species for the lions, remember, in all these areas, grew exponentially for this period of time. But were reasonably stable thereafter, with a few exceptions. So this is 1993. There was a severe drought in the Serengeti, and there was a massive die-off of wildebeest and of buffalo. And I'll get back to that later. Okay, so a big part of the lion's diet was much more abundant going through the 1960s to the 70s, and then reasonably stable, but with some perturbations thereafter. So if we look at the lion populations, remember we know every single animal in our study area by individual recognition. We could see that the Serengeti lions, beginning with Schaller study in mid-1960s, showed an increase. So these blue are this is mothers and cubs, everybody. This is just the adult lions. And so what we see is that the cub survival suddenly popped up in a certain year, and then the population was at a stable equilibrium for a while, and then popped up again, stable equilibrium. And this red line I'm going to talk about shortly, but this was now a disease outbreak, another pandemic, in the lions themselves, where their population crashed, stayed down for a while, but then recovered all at once, and then went to another equilibrium. Now this is in the woodlands, where lions have access to not only the migratory prey, but also resident species like buffalo. And so they have a more stable food supply than the lions on the plain. What we see out here is that in the plains, again, there was a population increase through the 1960s and 70s. And then another crash. They were also affected by the rinderpest, but then a big increase again sometime in the 1990s. Now, I've drawn these green areas because these are periods of time, because we know the wildebeest population was increasing here, and we know that other changes were going on, that there was, in a sense, an abundance of food for the lions. But it took them a while, and they didn't go up gradually at the same rate as their prey, but they went up all of a sudden. Okay. And what we see is down here is that what this typically is the result of is that there were new prides forming. Whole new social groups were able to get in place and to remain following these changes. So it was something that was affecting the whole population, and that groups themselves were able to pop up in number. Well, what was causing some of these things? So during the 1980s, so the 1960s, that was the recovery from rinderpest and the major prey population. There was this other period here in the 1980s where the population of the woodlands popped up again. And this is Tony's work again. He was able to show that as the wildebeest population went up, the amount of wildfire in the Serengeti went down. And as the wildfires went down, this meant that there was a period here where there was very little removal of young trees. And so the tree recruitment went up dramatically in the mid-1980s. And this led to an increase in the lion population. As we see this increase in the lions here in the woodlands. because the more cover there is, the better successful they have hunting their prey. So the prey were not necessarily more abundant, but they were more accessible. And I like showing this picture because that's not for seedlings or young trees. That's the legs of a giraffe that doesn't see the lion because it's hidden in the base of the tree. So as the amount of cover went up, the lions were better able to capture their prey, and this allowed their population to go up. Out on the plains, we saw a similar bump up in the population, but it was much later. And the plains didn't have a change in the amount of tree cover, but there was a vast change in terms of the grass cover, where an area that was ordinarily had very short grass, the grasses were able to grow much taller beginning sometime in the 1990s as a result of very heavy rainfall due to the changing climate of the world, where we had these big, more intensive El Niños. So Grant Hopcraft, who I mentioned earlier, was measuring the grasses along with Tony during this period of time. We can see how grass height went up. And in the parts of the plains along Transect 3 here, for example, it's over here where the lion numbers actually went up. So they were able to take advantage of taller grass. There's a lion right there, and it's unseen by its prey. So what we've seen in the Serengeti is that there are annual variations, and these are driven largely by the El Nino Southern Oscillation. This is another paper by Tony Sinclair driving this, this particular illustration. And that when the El Nino from the prior year is exceptionally strong or weak, this affects the amount of rainfall that we get in the Serengeti. So any of you who've ever thought about global climate, it's the different rainfall, it's the different barometric pressure between Tahiti and Darwin, Australia, can influence the amount of rainfall that we get in the Serengeti, which is in East Africa, thousands of miles away, the next year. Well, the more rainfall you get during the dry season, then you also then have more vegetative growth, obviously. And the more vegetative growth we have in our study area, the less likely they were to go up to Kenya. And so they'd stay down in our study area. And so as the index goes up or down, then we have a higher proportion of wildebeest in the lion's diet in our Serengeti study area. And then in the dry years, when the wildebeest aren't hanging around because there's not sufficient rainfall, then the lions switch. And instead of feeding on wildebeest, they're feeding on buffalo. So to summarize that, what we see is that the dry season diet of the Serengeti lions is strongly affected by rainfall. So if there's more rainfall, they're able to get more wildebeest in their diet, and then they don't eat as much gazelle, so that's a negative effect. If they have more wildebeest, the zebra follow the wildebeest around, or rather the wildebeest and the zebra follow each other around. And so we also get more zebra in the lion's diet. And if there's less rainfall, if there's more rainfall, there's less buffalo, just as I showed before. And if there's more zebra in the diet, again, they're not going to eat buffalo. So they switch between either the migrant species or these difficult to catch buffalo, or these rather small prey, warthogs. So these are harsh dry season prey. These are good dry season prey because of the rainfall. Okay? And so what we see is that the dry season rainfall has a strong impact. I don't want to go through that, but the more rainfall there is in a dry season, these are the conditions when lions are best able to raise cubs, where they're best able to keep up that good belly size, and in order to have more offspring, that allow them to have more offspring. Okay, so that's the food influencing the lion population in the Serengeti. And those are qualitative differences that we see. We've had quantitative measures, but I can't tell you how many wildebeest the lions are actually eating and how that relates to the lion numbers in the Serengeti. But while I'm in the Serengeti, I want to stick with a few more things that we know that influence lion populations. And one is that you have a group of lions that have a resident male coalition. The resident male coalition fathers all the cubs in the pride during their tenure, and should they be replaced, an incoming coalition of males systematically kills all the cubs of their predecessors. So this is infanticide. And so all the cubs less than 6 months of age, they're exposed to new males. This is a subset of data that we did many years ago, where we actually did the paternity testing. So we knew who the fathers were for sure, absolute 100% who the fathers were. And we knew that males that were coming into a new pride, and these were definitely their stepchildren, not their biological children, all their cubs died. As the cubs get older, they don't die immediately. They don't die in the next month after the male takeover, but there are other impacts of the male takeover. So when males come in, daughters from the previous coalition who are not yet old enough to mate, so they're not sexually mature till they're about 30 months of age or so, they leave and they'll form new prides. So subadult females leave at the onset of new males. If we look at young males, their survival rate depends on how old they are when they're exposed to a new set of males and whether they disperse or not. And if, in the worst case, they are evicted when they're relatively young, their survival rate is really low. So males suffer continued mortality well after they're too old to be killed directly by the males. And instead, they've now dispersed where they suffer higher mortality. And I want to go with that. Okay, so this actually, I digressed onto sexual selected infanticide for the following reason, that at the population level, what we see is that males are an important demographic factor. And so if you have a lot of male takeovers, then you're going to have more infanticide and you're going to have less recruitment in those years. What this shows is that there are variations from year to year in how many nomadic male coalitions are out there looking for prides, looking for opportunities to take over a set of females, kill their cubs, etc. And so there's some years with a high number of nomadic males wandering around, and some years where it's relatively low. Now, I've plotted this out through time because I do want to digress here a little bit again within my digression, that what we've seen is that the number of nomadic males that came into the Serengeti study area increased as the overall population increased. Remember that graph I showed a while before. But in the last couple of decades, it actually went down. And what we believe is that there were fewer males in other parts of the ecosystem were reaching maturity because they were being more affected by poaching. There's a lot of poaching in the Serengeti ecosystem. Thousands and thousands of wildebeest every year are killed in poacher snares. And so we think that this came down during this period of time because of poaching. And also there's a lot of human-lion conflict. Lions will eat cattle and then they'll be killed in retaliation. So there's sort of an absence because there's fewer coalitions here, despite the fact that in our study area, the number of prides continually increased. The overall population was generally thriving within our study area, but these males are not all originating within our study area. They're coming in from other parts of this much bigger Serengeti ecosystem. And so the more nomads, the higher the proportion of these prides in the study area are exposed to takeovers. And then the more of coalitions, then the worse the cub survival, either to their first birthday or their second birthday. So that's just a digression. So there's a lot of things that influence reproductive rates that we can see in the Serengeti. A third thing that we know is important, and I showed on that graph, is disease. And there was a famous outbreak in 1993 where we found that that population, I'll go back here, we see this red line. This is the disease outbreak. And the woodlands population crashed from about 120 down to less than 90. And the woodlands population at that point happened to be fairly high temporarily. And then there's again high mortality in that year. And so we had been collecting blood samples since the early 1980s, and we could look according to the age that each animal was of its birth and then the date of its sampling. And we construct a seroprevalence curve like this, and we saw that in the period between 1984 and 1993, that none of the lions born between 1982 and 1991 had been exposed to CDV. So it had a vulnerable population. So this is like a COVID-19 situation where the whole population, nobody has antibodies for this virus. And then when we sampled again, starting in December 1993 through September 94, all the older individuals are coming down with CDV, as were even the youngest. So animals that had just been born, we're seeing. So the virus was there. Boom, it came in as an epidemic. And what we see is that of the many disease outbreaks that we were able later to infer based on this kind of analysis, that only that 1994 distemper outbreak had a huge impact on the population in the Serengeti. And so yearling survival was way down, cub survival was way down. And this is just, hey, you've heard about herd immunity, and we could see that here's the CDV in 1994. Not only did it happen to be a fairly hot virus that was there, but also the entire population was susceptible. And so wham, it ran all the way up to 85% of all the lions that we sampled after 1993 were positive. So it really spread through the entire population. Okay, so why did it kill the lions? Well, we don't think it was because of the genetics. It wasn't like it was COVID-19 versus seasonal flu. It was that the CDV happened to coincide with something else. And that something else was a serious drought. And the serious drought, which I mentioned earlier, had led to a die-off in the wildebeest and in the buffalo. And in the Serengeti, in this 1993-1994 outbreak, what we see is that suddenly buffalo is huge in the lion's diet. They're eating more buffalo in these couple of months than we'd ever seen before. And also in that period of time, Tony Sinclair, again from UBC, was going around, and his staff, they would find buffalo carcasses, they'd crack open the long bones, and they would rate the quality of the bone marrow. And if the bone marrow was very high quality, those were healthy buffalo. But boom, here during the drought, terrible. It was the lowest he'd ever seen. So you have sick buffalo there. Now, later in the Ngorongoro crater, which I haven't gotten to yet, and I'm about to switch to shortly, we had a big problem in 2000, 2001, again with a buffalo die-off. Buffalo are way in the diet all of a sudden, and that was another drought. So the worst drought in the crater over this period of time was here. The worst drought in the Serengeti was over here. Both of these coincided with buffalo die-offs, and they both happened to coincide with distemper outbreaks. And what we found then is that during this period of time, the lions are feeding on a lot of buffalo. The buffalo are sick. The buffalo are immunocompromised, and they're carrying tick-borne diseases. And so they carried a disease called Babesia, which I haven't labeled on here. I'm sorry. Oh, there's Babesia. There's the word. So it's a blood parasite that is transmitted by ticks. The lions are eating more buffalo. They're eating sick buffalo during this period of time. And if we do a PCR analysis, they're getting huge exposure to Babesia. Their blood system is just jam-packed with this blood parasite, okay, in the die-off in the Serengeti in 1994 and in the crater in 2001. I have to put these on different scales because we use different measures at different times, but the peak is clear during both outbreaks. What we see is that the higher the level of exposure to the Babesia, the higher the mortality rate, okay? So that's what these two are supposed to show here. And so in both cases, what we're finding is that if you had a high level of Babesia and you had distemper, you had to have the combination, then that was fatal. That was killing the lions. And the reason that that's a fatal combination is that canine distemper is immunosuppressive. So coming down with canine distemper is like having a short, sharp bout of AIDS. And then some other disease can then overwhelm you. And so they're being overwhelmingly challenged with Babesia. At the same time, they're immunosuppressed from CDV, and that's why their mortality rate peaked like that. Okay, so I'm now in the crater. We've seen the time switch here. And what I need to do here is to tell you about this population. that we have a history here. It's even a longer time series. Again, we know every single lion that's resident on the crater floor going back to the early 1960s. Famously, there was a die-off from some sort of disease in about 1962, 63. The population then shrank down to about 10 individuals or so, and then it went through exponential growth, went up. There could have been over 90 to 100 lions for much of this period of time, and then the population started to go down again, and it went down in discrete bouts. So here's a big drop here, another drop because of the high cub mortality there, a big drop there. So we had these 4 strange years where, for whatever reason, the population was going down, okay? And what we can see on the ground with the lions there is that going back to the distemper outbreak, we lost probably in the Serengeti on the order of 1,000 lions in the overall ecosystem. So we assume the Serengeti had about 3,000 lions. Well over a third died from the distemper outbreak. And this is the age-specific mortality rates. And so what we expect to see in any population is old individuals are more susceptible to the daily slings and arrows of life. And infants also have higher mortality, so you get this kind of J curve. During the outbreak of distemper, though, it was elevated mortality at all ages, okay? And what we see during these 4 lines here is really high levels of mortality in ages that we wouldn't expect. A lot of middle-aged animals, young animals, are dying much higher than we'd expect from the background. So these look like more disease outbreaks. Okay, so I want to do this now because in the crater, we can do something we could not do in the Serengeti. I could show you that in years with higher rainfall in the dry season, the lions would have more wildebeest and zebra in their diet, but I couldn't tell you how many wildebeest were there to be caught by the lions. But in the crater, I can do that. And so what I'm going to do now is to show you a different system that has a lot more details on prey abundance as well as the lion abundance. But I also want to show you how the population of lions is density dependent. And then I'm going to show you what sets that dependence at a certain level and not another. So what we see is that in years like here, when there are very few lions, well, the population will really increase. So this is clear density dependent recovery after that disease outbreak. And so when you had a very small population, in the following year, the population could grow really rapidly. The prey population was not affected by whatever these diseases were. These are diseases of lions, not of the prey, okay, with the exception of that one. But nothing was going on with the prey population. And so the lion population grew rapidly when it was small, but at higher populations, you're getting very low recruitment. And so at about 80 individuals on the crater floor, that's the sort of the 0 point. When the population's higher than that, population generally doesn't grow. When it's below that, it generally does grow, okay? And so what we also know is that as the population goes up, remember we measure belly size, and they're thinner. And so there's less food per capita at these higher populations, okay? Now, the prey in the Ngorongoro crater, because it's a small area, it's got high walls all the way around it, and there have been counts by the College of Wildlife Management in Moshi, Tanzania, that they've done this for just about every year for decades. And so we have the population sizes of wildebeest, those the triangles, zebra, and buffalo. And remember, in the crater, that's essentially all they eat, the lions. Only eat wildebeest, zebra, and buffalo. And what we see is that in these populations, they too have density dependence. And so the wildebeest population, if it's really low one year, it can have very high recruitment the next year, but at high populations, it doesn't, and obviously it wouldn't. And the very strong density dependence amongst the buffalo as well, okay? So we've got our prey population that appear to be limited by their own densities, so the food that they eat is only a certain amount. And through time, we've seen some changes. Wildebeest numbers have gone up and down. There happened to be really a lot back at the same time. There were very few lions back in the 60s, but the buffalo population has consistently grown through this whole period of time. Okay, So what I want to do is to put those things together, and I want to say, what do we see in terms of overall prey biomass in the crater floor? And so if we have dry season abundance, what we have is a fairly high amount of food for the lions, but this does vary from one year to the next. And the ratio of wildebeest equivalents to the lions has really varied a lot. Okay. Now, what I mean by a wildebeest equivalent is that this is a buffalo. They weigh a ton, practically a ton. And there's over 3 times as much food for a lion from a buffalo as there is from a wildebeest. The zebra is about 1.5 wildebeest. So if I merge wildebeest, zebra, and buffalo together into this single measure of wildebeest equivalents, we have, this is the amount that's there on the crater floor, very high all the time, but there's some year-to-year variations, and then the ratio of that to the lions really varies, okay? And so what we see is that if we look at the wildebeest equivalents per lion in the dry season, and then we look at the growth rate in the lion population, it depends extraordinarily closely on the prey biomass per lion. So density dependence fitted into the food supply, which we can measure in terms of wildebeest equivalents. And that crosses the line of 0 there at about 300. So my question at the beginning of my talk here was, how many wildebeest does it take to raise a lion? The answer is about 300. So if you have about 300 wildebeest in an area, that's enough to support 1 lion, okay? And that's from the dry season data. The wet season is noisier, and there's not a same sort of trend. So the dry season, even in the crater, which is a relatively stable food supply, that seems to be the critical time that sets how many lions can live on the crater floor. So we can predict there should be about those 80 lions that I showed earlier from the density dependence just of the lions, just on the basis of how many wildebeest equivalents there are. Okay, so in the Serengeti, I had to digress because of various things that are important to affecting lion populations. So I had to talk about the disease, and I also talked about infanticide. In the crater, I have to talk about something else, because the crater is a small, self-contained population. It's very inbred. And so we've done studies of the levels of inbreeding in the crater. They have less genetic diversity than the Serengeti lions. They have higher rates of sperm abnormality. That is not Mickey Mouse. That is an abnormal sperm from a male in Ngorongoro crater. And just this briefly summarizes that the males that are breeding on the crater floor, and this is a small population, right? Usually, 80s, it's kind of a happy number. Nearly all the males that are bred there in the last 50, 60 years were born there. Whereas in the Serengeti, remember, we had all those nomads coming in because it's part of a much bigger population. And so there's not dispersal into the crater like there is in the Serengeti. It's a small, isolated population. And we have just a bunch of stuff on there that's just talking about the degree of, the low degree of dispersal and movement within the population. But I'm going to focus on here is that we have times when there were a few immigrant males in the crater. And during those periods of time, when they got into a pride, they were resident and they fathered offspring. If the females got pregnant, we would actually see the cubs. They would survive those first few weeks. What I've not told you about is in trying to measure cub survival, we don't see cubs till they're about 3 weeks old. But we know that there's a fair number of cubs that are lost just in the first few weeks of life. And when they had 2 crater parents, we would see a lower proportion of them. Fewer of them would survive to the time that we could actually see them. Whereas when they're outcrossed, there were. So it seems like the inbreeding here affects early survival. So the first week or so postpartum, it doesn't affect litter size. And once we see them, they've come out and they've at least made it through the first month or so of life, there's not that much difference in their survival. So the inbreeding seems to affect the population here in terms of its very early cub survival. Okay, so this is noisy. Sorry about this, but this is showing the changes. So the lion population in the crater crashed. There was a disease outbreak. It recovered. These series of disease outbreaks. And these blue lines now are when there were some males that did actually manage to come into the crater. So there was male immigration when the population was really small and relatively defenseless. So males from the further away from the crater were able to enter. And then we recently had some males come in again, but a long period when they couldn't. And so all I really want to show here with this is that there's a proportion of time when the population was really very inbred. And fortunately, we've had some males who've happened to come in, and now the level of outcrossing in the population is relatively good again for the first time in decades. And this is not an accident. So starting in about 2014 or 15, one of my former students started working with the local communities around Ngorongoro to stop them from killing every lion that killed a cow. I mentioned earlier with the nomadic males, we're seeing fewer nomadic males in the Serengeti than we used to see in the past. And we think that's because of higher levels of poaching and higher levels of human-wildlife conflict. And in Ngorongoro Crater, this is an area, once you get up on that crater rim, Maasai are allowed to live up there. They're allowed to herd their cattle. And so the lions were just typically just being hammered every time they killed a lion until Ingala started working there. And now we are seeing movement of males back and forth between the Serengeti into the crater for the first time. So we're now reasonably optimistic that at least this factor will perhaps allow the population to grow again. And the reason that this has been held so far below, and why we've often had opportunities to see, that they do well at lower populations, because they're being pushed down because of these disease outbreaks that they become so susceptible to because of this long history of inbreeding. Okay, I probably said enough, but I just want to go through very quickly. I did promise I'd say something about do lions, are they just influenced by their food supply? What about other species? Can other species have a negative impact on lion numbers? And briefly, the answer is no. First, this is just showing that, just skip it. We do know that other animals are predators on lion cubs. For example, cheetah will kill lion cub toys anyway. We know that leopards kill lion cubs, hyenas kill lion cubs, and so they could potentially be a problem. But when we look at the numbers of lions versus cheetahs versus wild dogs, for example, we find that lions have a strong negative effect on wild dogs. So famously, the wild dogs in the Serengeti were locally extinct for over a dozen years, but that coincided with the lion population really increasing out on the plains. Remember, I showed that big increase in the lion population from the taller grass. Well, that was bad for the wild dogs. And we've also got data from a number of private reserves in South Africa showing that, so here's the lion numbers. With more lions, you get fewer wild dogs. Lions don't seem to have a negative effect on cheetahs. We can't see any effect of cheetahs on lions. This is a study of wild dogs in small reserves in South Africa, again, where there are more lions in some of these small reserves, there are fewer wild dogs. So they're bad. Lions are really bad for wild dogs, but not vice versa. And that just shows how they do it. Other studies, this is from Botswana, that show cool stuff. Okay, lions hate leopards. Leopards are predators on lion cubs, on jackals, on any number of other small carnivores. Lions absolutely hate them. They'll kill them when they can. They tend to use different kinds of habitats. It looks like the leopards are avoiding areas where they might find lions. This is from Guy Baum's study in South Africa. We don't have such good data like this on Serengeti. All of this is from Guy Baum and Susan Miller's work down there. And what we see here is that in areas, this is in one particular reserve, that as the conditions presumably for lions and leopards both improve, both species might increase in numbers, but as you get to a certain point with more and more lions, the leopard population starts going down. So it looks like lions are bad for leopards at high densities, kind of having the same effect on leopards that they have on wild dogs. This is Kay Holekamp's work over here on the right, where lions hate hyenas too. hyenas kill their cubs. They also eat much of the same prey, although hyenas tend to take more juveniles than lions do. But this is a study up in Masai Mara by Kay Holekamp, where they've had an area where the lions were removed because of, again, a lot of conflict with Maasai. And when the lions were kind of speared out, poisoned out, or whatever, and the number of lions fell quite dramatically, like threefold loss, the hyena population went up. So it's likely that lions limit hyena populations, just like they limit wild dogs and probably leopards as well. And don't have time for that. So that's all I want to say.
Great, thank you very much. That was very interesting. I have a question of my own. Does interspecific competition for food influence lion-prey interactions? Do they change on the type of prey that they prefer when there's more competition with other species like cheetahs or wild dogs?
Well, so with cheetah and wild dogs, they take a very different kind of prey. So lions are really, they're wildebeest, zebra, and buffalo. That's their bread and butter. If necessary, they'll take gazelle because there's nothing else around. And if possible, they love scavenging gazelle off of cheetah and wild dogs. And so, people have often thought that lions are really bad for cheetah. And I didn't have to go in detail, but the lions do not have a negative effect on cheetah populations in the same way they do those other species. And it seemed to be because cheetah are they're the world's fastest animals, so they can get out of the way, and they're pretty good at being surreptitious when they're near the lions. And so the cheetah are kind of ducking and darting, staying a safe distance from the lions, whereas the wild dogs have dens. It's very easy for lions to go in there and disrupt everything. And they also are in the same kind of habitat with the leopards, so they can hammer those. So anyway, for at least those two species, there's no real issue for the lions. And in fact, if they see a cheetah kill, yes, that's a free lunch, and they'll go for it. As far as the hyenas go, they are the ones that have the most similar diet to the lions. But as I very quickly mentioned, the hyenas mostly kill foals and fawns and calves. And so again, the lions they're eating the larger prey. They're going after the adults. And there might be some sort of kind of indirect competition there, that if the if the hyenas, if they were to be too active in an area, it might shift the prey somewhere else. But I just don't get a sense that that's a big deal. One of the things that people talk about with lions versus hyenas was my last slide, and maybe I'll show it, is this. This is terrible. And so pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, but you've got lions feeding in a carcass, and sometimes hyenas show up as if the hyenas are going to scavenge. Well, they only get the leftovers. So where the hyenas are actually show up at a carcass, if there's much of the carcass left, if most of the food has been consumed, if not all of the food has been consumed, there's still something to eat when there's more than a quarter of the carcass remaining. What you see is the lions generally feed everything, and they eat it all up. They eat their fill. If it's a group of lions, what we see down here is if we have a lone female, and the hyenas are showing up, then they may lose some of their carcasses. They typically are still able to eat about half of them, despite the fact that there are hyenas around, but about half the time they do lose them, okay? But what's the cost? If you lose it, basically this is just a bunch of stuff to get to this. This is C. If you were, and this is the observe, if you're feeding alone and there's hyenas are showing up, you're going to get about 20 kgs off of that carcass, okay? If you were to say, okay, I don't want to be alone next to a hyena, I need a partner so we can, protect our carcasses against it, you'd have to divide your food in half with your partner, right? So people get all upset when they see lions losing a carcass to a hyena, and it's like, well, yeah, they lose a bit, but mostly they eat their fill. And if she had a partner there, then she'd get half as much. So I don't think it's as much of a thing as people have always thought.
Thank you. That's very interesting. We have a few questions coming in from the members of the audience. First, you said that a lion needs about 300 wildebeest equivalents to eat
Yeah.
life size, but how many would you do you estimate a lion actually kills over its average lifespan?
Over its lifespan. So, I mean, who knows? I don't know. I mean, they feed every few days. A proportion of it's this, a portion of it's that. I haven't actually made that calculation. I don't know. I mean, it would be a back of an envelope thing.
Another question we have is, do predators play a protective role in prey disease ecology by selectively removing infected individuals from the population?
I would love to know the answer to that. And we wrote a paper on that years ago. And we talked about keeping the herds healthy and alert, because it's always been a thought that predators could be really good for prey population because they reduce the sickest individuals. They remove them. That's a kind of quarantine, right? That's the ultimate in social isolation. You're sick, boom, you're eaten before you can spread the disease. I don't know of any data. I've been looking for it. I've been looking for opportunities to study that exact question. In brief, though, it would have to be, I mean, what we asked was whether the benefits of removing sick individuals could have a net positive on the overall prey population. And for that, the impacts of the disease would have to be really high, and the predation rate would have to be really low, right? So then essentially more animals are dying of disease in a year than they are being eaten by predators. And I don't know in most years if how that works out. And again, I mean, they'd have to be taking out the ones that, you know, are once they're sickened to the degree that they can be caught more easily. They may have been shedding the disease for a few days before then. So a lot of it depends on all the things we're thinking about right now with corona. We just don't know.
There's another question. When there are migrant males that enter the crater, do they always are they always successful in replacing a crater male? And if so, is it this due to a disadvantage of the migrant of the specific male that's in the crater, or an advantage of the migrant male?
So I had to spend a long time setting us up just for what they eat. And I also need to spend a bit of time on how their social system works. And so you have a pride of females that may consist of up to 20 individuals. And they breed synchronously after a takeover because they've all lost their cubs at the same time. And they can then spawn a whole cohort of young males. And we've seen coalitions of 9 males. And so they'll take over prides as a unit. In the crater, because the food supply is so consistent and cub survival is generally pretty good, the prides there frequently are producing coalitions of sons that are about 4 males. And a coalition of 4 is really formidable. And the immigrant males that we've been having mostly that have come in over the last 50 or 60 years have been singletons or pairs. And they just cannot compete against a quartet. And so that big optimistic bloom at the end of the time series there, where there was a lot of males that came in, that was a quartet. And we don't know where they came from, but that was the first time we saw such a large coalition come in. And with 4 males, they were able to outcompete the residents on the crater floor, and they became resident for quite a long time. But most of those immigrants had been singletons, and they just couldn't compete successfully against the larger crater-born coalitions.
Are there any important disease outbreaks currently going on, either in the lion populations or the prey populations that you know of?
So the distemper had the most conspicuous impact. And there's also a disease that we see as more of a problem in southern Africa, bovine tuberculosis. And both of those cause disease, but not always, and not always enough to have much of an impact. So we've had at least 7 distemper outbreaks in the Serengeti during the period that I was there, but only one caused significant die-off. And it was just that one time when the distemper happened to coincide with the drought and the high level of Babesia. So it was the co-infection of Babesia and distemper that was so harmful to the lions. The other 6, distemper arrived, and we hardly even knew they were sick. We might see a few runny noses, and then when we did the blood samples, we said, "Oh, look, use those age prevalence curves. Oh, that was a distemper outbreak." And in southern Africa, bovine tuberculosis was a big problem in a small reserve called Shislui and Filosi. And Shislui and Filosi is a small population that's even more inbred than the crater lions. It descends from 3 ancestors, and they became incredibly inbred. And then they became incredibly susceptible to bovine tuberculosis. So it looks like, well, and then I actually was involved. We did a translocation where we brought some fresh blood into Shislui and Filosi. So we brought in lions from a different part of South Africa. They then bred with the Shislui animals. The imported animals plus their hybrid offspring were resistant to bovine TB. It was just those highly inbred individuals that suffered from the bovine TB. So between that study and all of our work in Ngorongoro, it looks like inbreeding has a major impact on these populations by reducing the ability of their immune systems to withstand these kinds of serious infections. So if they're exposed to something nasty like distemper and or bovine TB, then they get hammered. Meanwhile, in Kruger National Park, which is the largest population of lions in South Africa, they also have bovine TB, but the effects are tiny in comparison to those in Shislui and Filosi. If we had not done that intervention, the lions would have gone extinct in Shislui and Filosi. And in fact, a few years after we brought in the new animals, all the purebred lineage did go extinct. So inbreeding seems to have a major effect on their immune response.
Thank you very much for that. I think this is all the time we have for today, but thank you very much again for accepting our invitation and for your excellent talk.
Very welcome.
For everyone watching, do join us again this Friday for another exciting talk. Our speaker will be Professor Jessica Metcalf from Princeton University with a talk about the drivers and consequences of sex differences in immune function. Until then, have a great day, everyone, and goodbye.